August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal. For the Imperial Japanese Army, the Pacific War was supposed to unfold according to patterns already proven in China and Southeast Asia. Japanese doctrine, hardened by years of asymmetric warfare, assumed that victory belonged to the side that could strike hardest at morale. Battles were not merely contests of firepower, they were tests of spirit. Enemies who lost the will to fight would collapse long before they were physically destroyed. This belief shaped everything Japanese commanders thought they understood about their enemies, especially Americans. American society, as Japanese intelligence assessed it, was decadent, individualistic, and ill-prepared for sustained hardship. Soldiers raised in such a system, Japanese planners believed, would falter when isolated, panic when surrounded, and retreat when faced with night assaults. Darkness, confusion, and relentless pressure had broken Chinese formations repeatedly. It was expected to break Americans even faster. When U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, Japanese officers did acknowledge one uncomfortable fact: these were not ordinary troops. The United States Marine Corps had a reputation for discipline and professionalism. But professionalism was not the same as resilience. Intelligence briefings reassured commanders that Marines, despite training, lacked the spiritual depth necessary to endure prolonged combat without collapse. Guadalcanal was meant to prove this assumption correct. The Japanese response to the landings was swift and aggressive. Night attacks, the hallmark of Japanese infantry tactics, were launched almost immediately. The jungle, thick and oppressive, was considered an ally. Visibility was minimal. Command and control favored forces accustomed to operating in darkness. The Americans, it was believed, would panic under such conditions. They did not. From the first nights around Henderson Field, Japanese assault units encountered something deeply unsettling. Marine positions did not dissolve when communication was cut. Units did not abandon their lines when officers were killed. Small groups fought independently, maintaining cohesion even when surrounded. Counterattacks, aggressive, sudden, and violent, erupted from positions Japanese troops believed neutralized. The night was no longer a weapon that belonged exclusively to Japan. One engagement became emblematic of this collapse in expectations. Lieutenant Shigeru Fukudome, a seasoned officer and veteran of the China campaigns, led a company-sized force, approximately 200 men, in a night assault intended to punch through Marine defenses near Henderson Field. The terrain was jungle-choked, uneven, and suffocating. Conditions were ideal for infiltration. The assault failed catastrophically. Marine defensive fire was coordinated, disciplined, and relentless. When Japanese troops closed in, Marines did not retreat. They held their ground, engaging at close range. As the night descended into chaos, Marine counterattacks drove into the Japanese formation, fragmenting it entirely. By dawn, Fukudome's company no longer existed as a fighting force. Fewer than half survived, 12 Marines were dead. The numerical disparity was impossible to ignore. Japanese after-action reports, diaries, and personal accounts reveal something unprecedented: confusion. The assault had followed accepted tactical principles. The terrain had favored the attacker. The psychological shock of night combat had been expected to unhinge American defenders. Instead, it was the Japanese attackers who broke. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers began writing words that would have been unthinkable months earlier. They described Americans who did not fear darkness, who did not retreat when outnumbered, who advanced even when isolated. The tone was not yet fear, but disbelief. Guadalcanal dragged on, and with it, the erosion of Japanese confidence accelerated. Repeated engagements produced the same results. Marines absorbed attacks that should have shattered them. Units that should have collapsed under losses continued fighting with undiminished aggression. Attempts to infiltrate Marine lines resulted in violent close-quarters combat rather than panicked withdrawal. Japanese doctrine had assumed that morale broke before bodies did. On Guadalcanal, Marines demonstrated the opposite. What disturbed Japanese commanders most was not Marine firepower. Though American artillery and machine guns were formidable, but Marine behavior. Casualties that should have forced withdrawal did not. Losses that would have crippled Japanese units seemed to have little effect on Marine operational tempo. Positions were held until physically overrun. When pushed back, Marines counterattacked almost immediately, often at night, reclaiming ground Japanese forces had just paid dearly to seize. This was not how Americans were supposed to fight. Japanese intelligence officers attempted to rationalize what they were witnessing. Some blamed poor coordination, others suggested that Marines were temporarily buoyed by novelty or leadership. But as weeks turned into months, these explanations collapsed under the weight of repeated evidence. Guadalcanal did not produce a decisive Japanese victory. Instead, it produced something far more dangerous for Imperial Japan: doubt. Doubt in doctrine, doubt in assumptions, doubt in the idea that spirit alone could overcome material disadvantage. The psychological balance of the Pacific War began to shift in the jungle around Henderson Field. The Marines had not simply held ground. They had shattered a belief system the enemy Japan thought it understood did not exist. In its place stood something far more troubling: an adversary willing to endure isolation, darkness, and loss without surrendering initiative. By the time Japanese forces withdrew from Guadalcanal, one truth was impossible to escape: the myth of American weakness was dead. And in its place rose a question Japanese commanders were unprepared to answer: what do you do when the enemy refuses to break? Guadalcanal did not merely challenge Japanese tactics, it forced Japanese commanders to confront something far more unsettling: the nature of the American Marine himself. As the campaign dragged on into late 1942, Japanese intelligence officers began compiling patterns from battlefield reports, prisoner interrogations, and recovered documents. Individually, these observations were disturbing. Together, they formed a picture that contradicted nearly every assumption Japan held about Western soldiers. Marines did not behave like an army expected to preserve itself. They behaved like an army designed to be spent. Japanese patrols discovered Marine positions that should have been abandoned hours earlier. Men fought on after wounds that would normally remove soldiers from the battlefield. Machine gun crews remained in place until annihilated, continuing to fire even as grenades detonated among them. Attempts to break Marine defenses by attrition failed repeatedly, not because Marines suffered fewer casualties, but because casualties did not seem to matter. This was incomprehensible to Japanese doctrine. Imperial Japanese infantry training emphasized spiritual resilience, but it also assumed rational limits. Units were expected to withdraw when combat effectiveness declined. Losses were to be avoided where possible, conserved for decisive moments. Even Bushido had boundaries. Death was honorable, but annihilation without purpose was wasteful. The Marines violated this logic entirely. Japanese after-action reports from Guadalcanal and subsequent engagements noted that Marine units continued attacking at full intensity even after suffering losses that should have rendered them ineffective. The assumption that casualties reduced combat power proved false. Instead, Marines appeared to grow more aggressive as pressure increased. Captured diaries revealed a further contradiction. Marines wrote openly about death, not with fatalism, but with acceptance. Sacrifice was not framed as tragic or glorious, it was framed as necessary. Letters home spoke of loyalty to fellow Marines rather than abstract ideals. Survival mattered less than holding ground, covering a retreat, or completing an objective. Japanese interrogators struggled to reconcile this behavior with American culture as they understood it. The explanation slowly emerged through interrogation transcripts and intelligence analysis. Marine training. Reports described Marine training as brutal, relentless, and psychologically transformative. Recruits were stripped of civilian identity and rebuilt around unit cohesion. Pain, exhaustion, and humiliation were not incidental, they were tools. The result was a soldier conditioned to endure discomfort without complaint and violence without hesitation. To Japanese officers, this was disturbingly familiar. Marine training resembled Bushido in outcome, but not in origin. Where Bushido drew strength from tradition and spiritual ideology, marine resilience was manufactured. It was engineered through repetition, discipline, and conditioning. Death was not glorified, it was normalized. But there was a critical difference that made this comparison terrifying. Marines were not constrained by scarcity. Japanese soldiers fought knowing replacements were limited, ammunition finite, and logistical support fragile. Marines fought backed by industrial power that dwarfed anything Imperial Japan could field. Losses could be replaced, weapons could be resupplied, units could be reinforced. This combination, a willingness to die paired with the ability to replace the dead, created a battlefield dynamic Japanese commanders had never faced. The Marine Corps did not fight like a traditional army seeking to preserve its strength. It fought like a system designed to trade lives for ground at a pace the enemy could not sustain. Japanese intelligence officers documented instances where Marine assaults continued despite what they described as irrational losses. Bunkers were assaulted head-on. Defensive fire that should have halted an advance merely slowed it. When Marines were stopped, they regrouped and attacked again, often immediately. The effect on Japanese defenders was profound. Combat against Marines produced exhaustion not from physical exertion alone, but from psychological strain. Defenders could not rely on causing casualties to stop an attack. Killing Marines did not end assaults, it often intensified them. This inverted the psychological logic of battle. Japanese tactics relied on breaking enemy morale through shock, surprise, and night action. Against Marines, shock failed, surprise failed, night failed. What remained was a grinding contest of endurance, one Japan was ill-equipped to win. As these patterns repeated, Japanese reports began to change in tone. Early contempt gave way to analytical concern. Language softened, then sharpened again, this time with unease. Marines were no longer dismissed as inferior. They were described as dangerous, unstoppable, and increasingly as inhuman. Yet Japanese officers understood this was not fanaticism in the religious sense. Marines were not suicidal. They did not seek death for its own sake. Their aggression was disciplined, purposeful, and relentlessly focused on objectives. This made them more frightening than an enemy driven by ideology alone. Japanese doctrine depended on predicting enemy behavior. Marines could not be predicted using existing models. They did not retreat when expected. They did not pause when logic suggested they should. They did not value manpower in the same way. By late 1942, Japanese commanders recognized that something fundamental had changed. The war was no longer a contest of spirit against decadence. It was a contest between two systems of sacrifice, one rooted in tradition and scarcity, the other in conditioning and abundance. The Marine Corps had fused psychological resilience with industrial warfare, and Imperial Japan had no answer for it. The realization spread quietly but inexorably through intelligence summaries and command briefings. Defeating Marines would require killing them almost to the last man. There would be no collapse, no mass surrender, no panic-induced victory, only destruction. This understanding would shape Japanese defensive planning moving forward, not toward maneuver or counterattack, but toward static defenses designed to extract the highest possible price. If Marines could not be broken, they would be bled. But even that strategy carried a terrible implication. Against an enemy willing and able to absorb losses indefinitely, bleeding them might not bring victory, it might only delay defeat. November 20th, 1943, Tarawa atoll. If Guadalcanal shattered Japanese assumptions and subsequent campaigns revealed the Marine mindset, Tarawa forced Imperial Japanese command to confront the terrifying arithmetic of Marine warfare. Rear Admiral Kiji Shibasaki was confident. His garrison of approximately 4,500 men occupied Peleliu Island, a fortress of concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and reinforced beach defenses. He famously declared that it would take 1,000,000 Americans 100 years to take the island. His confidence was grounded in logic. Tarawa's defenses were designed to destroy an enemy at the shoreline. Shallow reefs would strand landing craft hundreds of meters from the beach. Machine guns and artillery would annihilate assault waves in the water. Any force that reached shore would be pinned down, isolated, and eliminated. The plan assumed one critical factor, that casualties would halt the attack. The first Marine wave was cut apart before it reached the beach. Men drowned under the weight of their gear. Others were killed where they stood, water erupting around them under machine gun fire. The second wave fared little better, bodies piled along the reef. The shoreline became a killing ground. By every traditional measure, the assault had failed. Then the third wave came, and then another. And another. Japanese defenders watched in disbelief as Marines continued advancing through a storm of fire that should have ended the operation entirely. Losses mounted rapidly, yet the assault did not pause. Officers fell, non-commissioned officers took command. Those were killed, privates took their place. The Marine advance did not rely on momentum, it relied on inevitability. Once ashore, Marines pressed forward methodically. Flamethrowers neutralized bunkers thought invulnerable. Demolition teams placed explosives under direct fire. Grenades were hurled into embrasures at arm's length. Each position fell not because defenders ran out of courage, but because they ran out of options. Japanese intelligence officers studying the aftermath of Tarawa were forced to acknowledge a brutal truth. Casualties that would normally end an operation were built into Marine planning from the outset. This was not recklessness, it was calculation. Marine commanders assessed objectives, terrain, and defenses, then determined what losses were acceptable to achieve them. Once those losses were deemed acceptable, the operation proceeded regardless of cost. Japanese doctrine did not contain a comparable concept. Imperial Japanese planning sought to preserve combat power for decisive engagements. Losses were endured, but not expended deliberately. Tarawa demonstrated that the Marines viewed casualties not as a failure, but as a resource. This realization began appearing in captured intelligence reports by 1944. Analysts described Marine units as shock troops displaying fanatical devotion to objectives, but the language was clinical, not emotional. The reports emphasized a key point: Marine effectiveness did not degrade gradually. It remained high until units were physically destroyed. This understanding reshaped Japanese defensive strategy. On Bougainville and later Peleliu, Japanese commanders abandoned the idea of repelling landings at the shoreline. Instead, they constructed depth defenses designed to draw Marines inland, slow them, and inflict sustained casualties over time. Peleliu became the clearest demonstration of this approach. Japanese defenses there were designed to avoid decisive engagements. Fortified caves, interlocking tunnels, and mutually supporting positions aimed to delay and exhaust the attackers. The objective was no longer victory, it was attrition. Yet even this adaptation failed to produce the desired outcome. Marine units did not pause to reorganize after heavy losses. On Peleliu, half an airfield fell within hours because Marines refused to halt their advance. Japanese plans assumed that no rational force would continue attacking under such conditions. Marines did. Time and again, Japanese defenders were confronted with an impossible choice. Holding positions meant annihilation by flamethrowers and explosives. Counterattacking meant exposure to superior firepower. Retreat meant ceding ground that could never be retaken. Every option led to defeat. What Japanese commanders struggled to accept was that Marine losses, even catastrophic ones, did not alter the outcome. American replacements arrived. Equipment was replenished, operations continued. The mathematics were merciless. Japanese forces could inflict casualties, but they could not inflict them fast enough to change the strategic equation. For every Marine killed or wounded, another took his place. For every destroyed unit, another was deployed. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was devastating. Killing the enemy no longer provided reassurance. Success was no longer measurable. Survival became temporary, conditional, and meaningless in the long term. By late 1944, Japanese intelligence assessments ceased discussing how to defeat Marines. Instead, they focused on how long resistance could be sustained. This was the final collapse of Japanese operational illusion. The war had become one of endurance, not maneuver. And in a war measured by endurance, the side willing to spend lives and capable of replacing them held an insurmountable advantage. Tarawa had proven the equation, Peleliu had confirmed it. The final test would come on an island whose very name would become synonymous with sacrifice. Iwo Jima, February 1945, Iwo Jima. By the time American Marines landed on the volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima, the Imperial Japanese command no longer harbored illusions of tactical victory. Guadalcanal had destroyed assumptions, Tarawa had exposed the arithmetic of marine warfare. Peleliu had proven that even deeply layered defenses could only delay the inevitable. Iwo Jima was never meant to be won. It was meant to extract a price so high that the enemy would reconsider the war itself. More than 21,000 Japanese defenders were entrenched beneath the island, connected by miles of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified firing positions. General Tadamichi Kobayashi had abandoned banzai charges and shoreline defenses entirely. His strategy was precise, cold, and final: allow the Marines to land, then bleed them inch by inch. Japanese soldiers were ordered not to die gloriously, but to die efficiently. The Marines came ashore on February 19, 1945, and immediately encountered a silence more terrifying than gunfire. The beaches were uncontested, then the guns opened. Within minutes, casualties mounted at a rate that stunned even veteran Marine units. Volcanic ash offered no cover, movement was slow, exhausting, and exposed. Yet once again, the assault did not stop. Japanese observers inside the tunnel networks watched Marines advance through kill zones that should have halted any rational force. Men fell, others stepped forward. Platoons disintegrated and reformed under fire, the pattern repeated endlessly. Private First Class Tadashi Yamamoto, writing in his diary, recorded a thought that could have condemned him if discovered. The Marines are not human. It was not hatred, it was bewilderment. Yamamoto and others witnessed Marines throwing themselves onto grenades to shield comrades, advancing into bunker fire without hesitation, and continuing attacks after wounds that should have ended their participation in battle. Bunkers did not fall through maneuver or deception, but through relentless pressure, flamethrowers, explosives, and direct assaults repeated until resistance ceased. Mount Suribachi became the symbol of this confrontation. Japanese defenses there were layered, concealed, and mutually supporting. Every advance triggered fire from unseen positions. Yet Marines continued climbing, absorbing losses without pause. When positions were taken, Marines did not rest. They pressed forward immediately, denying defenders time to regroup. On February 23rd, when Marines reached the summit, the iconic flag-raising marked not triumph, but confirmation. Japanese command had been correct in one regard: Iwo Jima would cost the Americans dearly. By the battle's end, Marine casualties reached approximately 26,000, a staggering figure. But Kobayashi's deeper hope failed. The Marines did not break. Japanese defenders fought nearly to extinction. Fewer than 1,000 survived. The tunnels that were meant to prolong resistance became tombs. Defensive brilliance delayed the outcome, but could not alter it. For Japanese soldiers, the final realization was devastating. Every defensive choice, every bunker, every tunnel, every kill zone led only to a question of time. Against an enemy that treated casualties as currency, delay was the only achievable objective. Iwo Jima stripped away the last illusions of Imperial Japanese doctrine. The Marines were not reckless, they were systematic. They accepted losses not because they ignored them, but because they planned for them. The war was no longer a contest of courage or skill alone, it was a contest of endurance between unequal systems. And endurance favored the side that could absorb pain without surrendering momentum. For the Japanese soldiers who witnessed it, the psychological defeat was complete. The enemy they faced could not be intimidated, exhausted, or demoralized in the ways war had always worked before. On Iwo Jima, The battle was decided not by tactics, but by resolve measured in human lives, and by an enemy willing to spend them. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt, only its cost.